Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
No one expected Nicolas Cage, Hollywood's wild card, to turn a routine Good Morning America interview into one of the most talked about confrontations of the year. Sitting across from George Stephanopoulos, the Oscar-winning actor was invited to discuss his latest project. But when the conversation shifted to senior citizens being targeted by financial scams, the mood changed instantly. George, calm and measured, suggested that while scams were devastating, making them federal crimes might be too sweeping of a policy. Nicolas Cage's face darkened, his hands gripped the desk, and what followed was pure daytime TV electricity. Cage leaned forward, his voice trembling with passion. "George, do you have any idea what it feels like when your mother, your grandmother, your uncle gets ripped off of everything they worked for? You think that's a state issue? That's a crime against humanity." The studio gasped. George tried to regain control, but Cage wasn't finished. What unfolded over the next 10 minutes was part debate, part explosion, and it ended in a way no one saw coming. The morning show had started like any other. George Stephanopoulos, smooth and composed as always, leaned across the glossy desk with that trademark smile. "So, Nicolas," George began, "you've had a wild career, from stealing cars in Gone in 60 Seconds to hunting treasure in National Treasure. You've become something of a legend for your unique choices. Do you ever sit back and think, maybe I've done it all?" The audience chuckled warmly. Nicolas Cage grinned, leaning back in his chair with the kind of relaxed swagger that only he could pull off. "George," he said, "I don't think I've done it all. Not even close. Every role, every project, it's another chance to stretch myself. You know, acting isn't about checking boxes. It's about chasing the next truth." The audience applauded, some nodding as if they had just heard a little nugget of Cage wisdom they'd carry home. George smiled politely, waiting for his moment to pivot. "That's fascinating," George replied. "But speaking of truth, let's shift gears. There's been a lot of news recently about financial scams targeting older Americans. It's a heartbreaking trend. Some people have even suggested that scamming seniors should be prosecuted at the federal level, treated like a major crime. Others say that's an overreach. Nicolas, what do you think? The energy in the studio shifted immediately. The lightness drained from Cage's face. His posture stiffened. Gone was the playful actor, replaced by a man who suddenly seemed deadly serious. "What do I think?" Cage repeated slowly. His voice dropped an octave. He leaned forward, staring directly into George's eyes. "I think scamming seniors is theft of the highest order. And yes, it should be a federal crime, no question about it." The audience fell quiet. A few people clapped hesitantly, unsure if this was still part of the playful banter or something else entirely. George nodded calmly, but there was an unmistakable glint in his eyes, the look of a man ready to press harder. "But, Nicolas, we already have laws in place. State governments prosecute fraud all the time. Why escalate it to the federal level? Isn't that just creating more bureaucracy?" Cage's hands clenched against the desk. "Because state laws aren't enough," he shot back. "You think a scammer in New Jersey only calls New Jersey? No. They cross state lines. They operate on the internet. They prey on seniors everywhere. If that isn't federal, what is?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement. Others sat stiffly, waiting to see how George would counter. "Well," George said evenly, "the question is whether we want to involve federal prosecutors in cases that might be better handled locally. We're talking about limited resources. Do we really want to elevate every phone scam to the level of a federal case?" That did it. Cage's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. "George, with respect, When an 82-year-old woman loses her life savings because some slick con man pretends to be her grandson, that's not just a phone scam. That's destruction of a human life. These aren't numbers on a balance sheet. These are people who worked their whole lives only to be robbed in their final years. Applause broke out, louder this time. The audience was leaning toward Cage now. His intensity was pulling them in. George, still calm, shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his papers as if grounding himself. I understand the passion, but we need to think about the big picture. Federal courts are already overloaded. Resources are finite. Isn't it better to strengthen state enforcement rather than drag Washington into everything? Cage barked out a humorless laugh. The big picture? The big picture is that we've left millions of seniors unprotected because we don't take their suffering seriously enough. You want to talk about overloaded? Tell that to the single mom who has to move her parents into her living room because their retirement is gone. Tell that to the father who spent 50 years building a nest egg and now has to choose between food and medication. That's the big picture. The audience erupted in applause, and George's smile faltered ever so slightly. What had started as a routine morning segment was no longer routine. The sparks were officially on stage. George leaned in, his expression tightening just enough for the cameras to pick up the shift. He had been in thousands of interviews, sparred with politicians, CEOs, and celebrities. But there was something unpredictable about Nicolas Cage. Something that made every second feel like the set might combust. "Look," George said evenly, "no one's dismissing the pain of seniors who fall victim to scams. But elevating every case to the federal level? That's a recipe for gridlock. We're talking about a system that already struggles to move cases through in time. Wouldn't we just be creating delays and false hope?" Cage's jaw tensed. He leaned forward, resting both hands on the desk, and his voice rang with a sharp edge. "Delays? False hope? George, do you hear yourself? These aren't speeding tickets. We're talking about people being financially slaughtered at a stage in life when they can't rebuild. Seniors don't get a do-over." The audience clapped. A few even shouted, "That's right," from the back. Cage turned slightly toward them, nodding as if rallying them to his side. George, ever the professional, didn't flinch. "Nicolas, it's not about dismissing them. It's about being realistic. Federal courts were never designed to handle mass fraud cases. If you pull resources there, something else gives. Terrorism, cyber attacks, violent crime. Do you really want to tell taxpayers we're spending billions chasing down every scammer?" Cage sat back for a moment, but the fire in his eyes didn't dim. Instead, his voice grew louder, carrying across the set. "Yes, yes I do, because it's about priorities. You're telling me we can fund endless wars, bail out corporations, hand out tax breaks to billionaires, but when it comes to protecting seniors, suddenly we're broke? Give me a break, George." The audience erupted in applause again, louder than before. Cage wasn't just answering George, he was performing, channeling raw outrage into something that felt larger than the conversation. George raised a hand, trying to regain control of the room. "Passion doesn't equal policy, Nicolas. It's easy to stand here and make speeches, but lawmakers have to make trade-offs. What about personal responsibility? Families, communities? Shouldn't they be the first line of defense against fraud instead of the federal government swooping in?" That line hit a nerve. Cage's head snapped toward him. "Personal responsibility? So now it's their fault? You're blaming 80-year-olds for getting conned by professional criminals? That's like blaming a burglary victim for not having stronger locks. It's insulting, George." The studio went quiet for a beat. George had touched a sore spot, and Cage wasn't letting it go. George tried again, his tone slightly firmer. "I'm not blaming seniors. I'm saying we should empower families and local agencies. Washington isn't the solution to every problem." Cage leaned forward again, his finger tapping the desk for emphasis. except when the problem crosses state lines, uses international networks, and drains billions from our most vulnerable citizens. Then, it's not just a local problem, it's a national one, a federal one. Applause surged again. George glanced at the audience, clearly aware momentum was slipping. He straightened in his chair and went for the pivot. But Nicholas, don't you think there's a danger in making everything a federal crime? Where do we draw the line? Should every bad act, every fraud, every con, no matter how small, be federal? At what point does it become over-policing? Cage laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You talk about over-policing like seniors are criminals. They're the victims, George. And your where do we draw the line argument? Easy. We draw it at crimes that rob people of their entire lives. Seniors don't have the time to rebuild. They don't have 10 years to earn it back. They need protection now. The audience was fully with him now. People clapped, whistled, and a few even stood up briefly before the producers gestured for them to sit back down. George exhaled slowly, steeling himself. But Nicholas, making speeches on TV doesn't solve the underlying issue. Prevention does. Education does. Financial literacy programs, better local enforcement, that's how you protect seniors. Not by turning every scam into a federal case. Cage's voice dropped low, more dangerous than when he was shouting. Education doesn't stop predators. You can teach an 85-year-old how to spot a scam, but the truth is these criminals are always one step ahead. And when they win, they walk away with everything. Do you want to be the guy who tells a widow who just lost her savings, "Sorry, the feds were too busy and your state didn't have the money to fight back"? The question hung in the air. George didn't answer right away, and the silence gave Cage the upper hand. Because I wouldn't, Cage continued, his voice rising again. I'd look her in the eye and say, we'll hunt them down, wherever they are, whoever they are, because in this country, we don't abandon our elders. That's what leadership looks like. That's what justice looks like. The crowd roared. George shifted in his chair, lips pressed tight, his usual composure cracking ever so slightly. The clash wasn't just heating up, it was boiling over. The set, buzzing just moments earlier, fell into an uneasy silence. The audience leaned forward, sensing the conversation had crossed from sparring into something deeper. Cage's face tightened, his eyes narrowing in a way that didn't look rehearsed anymore. You want to talk about prevention and education, George? Cage's voice trembled, not with nerves, but with raw emotion. My mother got scammed. She was 82, a woman who raised me, supported me through every insane chapter of my career, and she trusted a voice on the other end of a phone. They told her her grandson, my son, was in trouble, that he needed money wired immediately. She sent it. Her savings, decades of her life, gone in 2 hours. The room went still. Even George's practiced face slipped. He wasn't expecting this. Cage's voice grew sharper, his words cutting through the air. Do you know what it's like to see your mom crying because she feels stupid? To watch her lose sleep because she thought she failed her family? That wasn't a local issue, George. That wasn't something the local police could handle. It was an international operation. And guess what? No one paid. No one was caught. And you're telling me this shouldn't be a federal crime? Applause burst through the quiet, but it wasn't the rowdy kind from earlier. It was heavy, deliberate, the audience clapping because they felt the weight of what Cage was sharing. George took a breath, his voice lower now. Nicholas, I'm sorry about your mother, truly, but personal stories, as powerful as they are, can't shape national policy alone. We have to look at scale, efficiency, cost. What happened to your mother was awful, but can we restructure federal priorities based on... Cage slammed his hand down on the desk, startling the room. His voice roared, every word drenched in frustration. Don't you dare minimize it. Don't you dare reduce what happened to her to a line about efficiency. This isn't a math equation, George. These are lives. These are people who worked their whole damn lives for a little security in old age. And they're being robbed while you sit here talking about balance sheets. The audience erupted, some standing again, clapping, a few shouting, "Tell him, Nicolas!" The cameras caught a woman in the front row wiping away tears. George, visibly rattled, tried to bring it back. I'm not minimizing it, Nicolas. I'm asking how we can practically implement it. If we open the door to federalizing all senior scams, we're talking thousands of cases a week. How do we fund it? Do we raise taxes? Do we cut defense? Do we cut health care? You have to give people more than slogans. Cage leaned in so close their foreheads nearly aligned. His voice dropped, husky but intense. Here's how you fund it. You stop pretending seniors are expendable. You stop hiding behind excuses. You take the billions wasted on nonsense and you redirect it toward protecting the very people who built this country. That's not a slogan, that's a moral obligation. The audience exploded again, but now George's jaw was clenched. He fired back, his voice louder than before. So we let emotion dictate everything? We govern by outrage? That's not how democracy works, Nicolas. You're not in one of your films. This is the real world. We need structure, balance, and yes, sometimes compromise. Cage didn't flinch. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried fury behind it. The real world? George, in the real world, seniors are losing everything, while you sit here talking about compromise. Compromise doesn't pay their rent. Compromise doesn't put food on their table. Compromise doesn't give them back the years they lose when their dignity is stripped away. Don't tell me this is about balance. It's about courage. And right now, I don't hear any courage from you. The crowd gasped, then cheered. The energy was electric, the room alive with tension that felt seconds away from boiling over completely. George, leaning forward now, his own frustration peeking through, shot back, "Courage isn't ignoring reality. Courage is telling people the truth even when it's unpopular. And the truth is, we can't federalize our way out of every tragedy. The system has limits." Cage's face reddened, his hands gripping the desk. Then maybe the system is broken, George. Maybe that's the point. And maybe people are sick of hearing polished lines from people like you while their lives get destroyed. If standing up for them makes me unrealistic in your eyes, then fine, call me unrealistic, but don't call me silent. The audience erupted again, some chanting, "Nicolas! Nicolas!" The set, the air, even the cameras seemed to vibrate with the intensity. For a brief moment, George didn't respond. He sat there, lips pressed together, eyes locked on Cage. The control he usually carried so effortlessly was slipping. Cage wasn't just winning the argument. He was commanding the entire room. And George knew it.
The tension in the studio had reached a point where you could practically feel it in the air, like static before a thunderstorm. George straightened his notes, visibly trying to regain composure, while Nicolas Cage sat with his jaw tight, his body leaning forward like a coiled spring. George cleared his throat, his voice firm but laced with agitation. "Nicolas, you've made your point, but shouting doesn't change the facts. America is a country of laws and budgets. We can't make federal cases out of everything that breaks our hearts." Cage's eyes widened in disbelief. "Everything that breaks our hearts?" His voice rose, sharp enough to make a few people in the front row flinch. "You're talking about millions of seniors being robbed blind. You're talking about people's lives, their entire nest eggs. That's not a heartbreak, George. That's a national disgrace." The audience erupted again, half clapping, half shouting. A murmur of voices carried through the studio, the kind of restless energy that producers backstage hate because it means the crowd is no longer neutral. They've picked a side. George's tone hardened, his anchor's polish cracking. "You want to make this personal, Nicolas? Fine, let's talk personal. How many times have you made reckless decisions with money? You bought castles, dinosaurs, exotic animals. You've been bankrupt. And now you want to lecture America on financial responsibility?" The gasp that tore through the audience was immediate and visceral. Heads whipped toward Cage to see his reaction. For a moment, Cage didn't move, his lips pressed together, his hands trembling on the desk. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stood. The cameras adjusted quickly, catching his towering frame as he leaned over George, his voice low but shaking with fury. "You think this is about me? You think because I made mistakes I don't get to defend my mother, my family, millions of families? Don't you dare use my past to excuse your failure to protect the vulnerable. Don't you dare." The room erupted again, some cheering wildly, others gasping, but George wasn't backing down. He rose to his feet too, shorter but refusing to shrink. "It matters, Nicolas, because credibility matters. If you want to tell America how to spend money, you better believe your own track record is fair game." The two men were inches apart now, faces lit by the stage lights, eyes blazing. Producers were waving frantically off camera, trying to calm the situation, but it was too late. The fire had caught, and nothing was going to put it out. Cage jabbed a finger toward George's chest. "Credibility doesn't come from a perfect past. It comes from standing up when it matters, from admitting mistakes and still fighting for what's right. My flaws don't disqualify me, George. They make me understand better than you ever could what it feels like to lose everything." The audience leapt to its feet, the applause deafening. A chant began to rise again. "Nicolas! Nicolas!" It was chaos. George raised his voice, straining to be heard. "This isn't a rally, it's an interview. You're turning this into theater, and these people deserve more than theatrics. They deserve the truth." Cage spun toward the audience, arms wide, his voice booming. "You hear that? He calls this theater. He calls your pain, your families being scammed, theater. Is that the truth you want?" The crowd exploded, clapping, whistling, stomping their feet. Even the camera operators looked shaken, zooming in and out to capture every charged expression. George finally snapped, his voice thundered, stripped of its usual calm. "I'm not dismissing seniors, Nicolas. I'm saying we can't legislate morality. No law will ever erase every scam, every con artist. People need to be vigilant too. Responsibility cuts both ways." Cage's face turned red, his voice cracking with intensity. "So it's their fault? It's my mother's fault for trusting someone? It's seniors' fault for believing lies designed to prey on their fear? You're blaming the victims, George. That's what you're doing. And I won't stand here and let you do it." For a heartbeat, the room froze. Then Cage slammed his hand on the desk so hard that the microphones rattled. The sound echoed through the studio like a gunshot. He leaned in, his voice seething but quiet, each word dripping with venom. "You should be ashamed of yourself." Gasps. A few audience members clapped nervously, others simply sat frozen, mouths open. George didn't respond. His jaw was locked, his eyes flashing with anger but also something else. Maybe doubt. For the first time, it looked like the veteran anchor had been knocked off balance. Cage straightened, exhaling sharply, his chest heaving. The set was in chaos, producers rushing, audience members shouting, applause mixing with jeers. What had started as a debate had become a battlefield, and there was no going back. And just when it seemed like the noise might swallow everything, Cage turned his back to George, looked directly into the camera, and said, If Washington won't protect our seniors, then the people need to demand it loudly, because this fight isn't about politics, it's about humanity. The audience roared, some standing on their feet again, while George stood silently at his podium, gripping his notes so tightly the papers crumpled. It was the breaking point, and everyone watching knew it. The set of Good Morning America felt like it had survived a storm. The applause still echoed faintly in the rafters, but the silence that followed was just as heavy. George Stephanopoulos stood rigid behind the desk, trying to gather his composure, while Nicolas Cage, still visibly shaking, lowered himself back into his chair. For a moment, neither man spoke. The camera zoomed in, capturing the aftermath like the closing shot of a courtroom drama. The studio audience was split, some still clapping and cheering Cage, others looking unsettled by just how raw the exchange had become. A woman in the third row, her voice trembling, shouted out, "Protect our seniors!" and the crowd responded with another ripple of applause. George finally broke the silence. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of frustration. These are important conversations, and as emotional as they get, they matter because lives are at stake. Nicolas, I respect your passion, even if I disagree with your approach. But Nicolas didn't answer. Instead, he looked out into the audience, his eyes tired now, but still burning. You all heard it. If you don't demand change, no one will. Don't wait until it happens to someone you love. The audience applauded again, softer this time, like a standing tribute rather than a roar. It was less about cheering Cage and more about recognizing the truth in what he'd said. By the time the cameras cut to commercial, social media had already exploded. Clips of Cage slamming his hand on the desk were everywhere. Hashtags like Cage versus George, Protect Our Seniors, and Say This Again began trending within minutes. One viral tweet read, "Nicolas Cage just gave the speech of his life. Someone get this man to Congress." Another countered, "George is right. We can't federalize every problem, but damn, Cage made me feel something." Cable news segments replayed the confrontation on loop. Commentators called it everything from a meltdown to the most honest moment daytime TV has seen in years. Back on set, the energy never fully calmed. George moved on to the next segment, but the tension in his voice betrayed the fact that the exchange had left a mark. Cage, meanwhile, didn't return for the usual post-interview banter. He stood up, gave a brief wave to the audience, and walked off stage before the show had even wrapped. It was messy. It was uncomfortable. And yet, it was unforgettable. Nicolas Cage had turned a morning interview into a national conversation about dignity, accountability, and what America owes its seniors. And for millions watching at home, one thing was clear. This was more than a clash. It was a reckoning. If you enjoyed this explosive moment, don't forget to subscribe for more dramatic celebrity showdowns, emotional confrontations, and the kind of unforgettable TV clashes you'll be talking about long after the cameras stop rolling.